The argument started the way most arguments between proud men start, quietly, almost politely, a single sentence that carried more weight than its words. It was the autumn of 1966, London, a narrow backstage corridor in a mid-sized venue in the West End, the kind of place that smelled like spilled beer and old cables, where the walls were covered in signatures nobody had bothered to read in years. The Who had just come off stage. Cream was preparing to go on. Somewhere in that corridor between equipment cases and half-eaten sandwiches, two of the most celebrated guitarists in England ended up standing within 5 feet of each other. Pete Townshend was 21. Eric Clapton was the same. Townshend had built the Who's sound on controlled destruction, windmill arms, smashed equipment, a guitar technique that sounded like organized violence. Clapton had built his on something closer to religion, blues, precision, the kind of playing that made grown men stop mid-sentence and just listen. Graffiti on the walls of London said Clapton is God. Townshend had seen that graffiti. So had everyone else. Good set? Clapton asked, not really asking. Always, Townshend said, not really answering. There was a pause, the kind that has weight. You break another one tonight? Clapton asked, nodding toward the guitar case being carried past them. Townshend smiled. That's the point. Clapton said nothing, but something in his silence said that's one way to do it. Townshend caught it. He always caught things like that. You disagree. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. Nobody recorded what was said in full that night. What survives are fragments. A few accounts from roadies and the recollections of two men who told the story differently depending on when they were asked. It began as technical discussion. Townshend talked about rhythm, about power chords, about how the guitar as a percussive instrument was fundamentally misunderstood by people who treated it like a delicate thing. Clapton talked about the blues, about feeling, about the difference between playing at an audience and playing to one. Each of them was really talking about himself. The conversation moved the way these conversations always move when two talented people circle each other, with increasing directness disguised as generosity. Compliments sharpened to fine points. Somewhere in the third or fourth exchange, the pretense fell away. There's nobody in the city playing at my level right now, Townshend said. He said it the way men say things they believe completely, but know they shouldn't say out loud. Clapton looked at him. Define level. You know what I mean. I know what you think you mean. The roadie who was nearby later said the temperature in that corridor dropped by several degrees. Neither of them raised their voice. That was the thing about it. Neither of them needed to. Down the corridor, approximately 12 feet away, a young man was sitting on an equipment case with a white Fender Stratocaster across his lap. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't even plugged in. His fingers moved across the strings with the sound turned all the way down. Just the quiet mechanical click of frets and the faint resonance of unplugged strings. He'd been there a while, long enough to have heard everything. Jimi Hendrix had arrived in London 6 weeks earlier. He was 23 years old, largely unknown outside of a small circuit of American R&B venues, and he was sitting 12 feet from two of England's most celebrated guitarists while they argued about which one of them was better. He did not look up. A technician who was coiling cables nearby recalled later that Jimi seemed almost absent, not distant in a rude way, just somewhere else, like a man quietly thinking about something that had nothing to do with the room he was in. But his fingers kept moving. The argument had reached the point where both men were no longer pretending to discuss something abstract. It was personal now, the way it always gets personal when identity is what's really at stake. Ask anyone who plays, Townshend said. Ask the musicians, not the journalists, the players. I have, Clapton said. They ask me. It was the most Clapton thing Clapton could have said. It wasn't bragging, exactly. It was just a fact delivered without decoration, which somehow made it land harder than bragging would have. Townshend opened his mouth to respond. That was the moment the venue's production manager appeared at the end of the corridor and called out that there was a change in the schedule. A guest. Someone was going to do a short set before Cream went on. An American guitarist. Chaz Chandler had arranged it. Just 2 songs. Maybe 3. Neither Clapton nor Townshend asked who it was. They went to watch, the way musicians always go to watch other musicians, with their arms crossed and their judgment already half formed. The stage was small. The lighting was basic. A single spot, roughly centered, catching dust in its beam. Jimi walked out carrying the white Stratocaster. He was wearing something assembled from 3 different decades. He moved without urgency, just a man walking to the place where he was going to do the thing he did. He plugged in, adjusted the amp with 2 small turns of a knob, turned back to the backing band, bass, drums, rhythm guitar, and said something too quiet for the audience to hear. The bassist nodded. The drummer clicked his sticks. Then it started. The first note was not loud. That was the thing people remembered afterward, with a consistency that suggested it had actually happened that way, and wasn't just the softening of memory. It was precise, clean. It bent slightly at the end, the way a sentence bends when the speaker isn't finished yet. Then the second note, and the third. By the fourth, something in the room had already changed. Clapton's arms uncrossed. He didn't notice it happen. It was involuntary. The same way you lean forward when something demands your full attention and your body responds before your mind does. He was at the side of the stage about 15 feet back, and he leaned forward slightly and his arms came apart, and he just stood there. Townshend, 3 feet to his left, had gone very still. Jimi was playing a blues progression, but the word blues felt inadequate for what was happening. It was blues the way a storm is weather, technically accurate and completely insufficient. He was bending strings to pitches that seemed to exist between the notes on a standard scale, hitting places that weren't supposed to be there, and every single one of them felt inevitable. Like the guitar had always been capable of this and had just been waiting for someone to find it. His voice when he started singing was a quiet devastation. Not loud, not aggressive, just unguardedly honest. The kind of voice that makes you feel you're hearing something private, excavated and placed in front of you without apology. The backing band found their footing around him. The bassist simplified. The drummer opened up. Even the rhythm guitarist seemed to understand that the best thing he could do was get out of the way. And Jimi played. 3 minutes into the performance, Clapton turned to say something to Townshend. He stopped when he saw Townshend's face. Townshend was watching Jimi's hands. Not his face, just his hands. With the focused attention of someone trying to understand a mechanism they've never encountered before. Clapton turned back to the stage. He watched Jimi's left hand move up the neck to a position that shouldn't have produced the sound it produced. He watched the right hand work the tremolo bar, not as a decoration, not as a flourish, but as a structural element, pulling pitch in directions that somehow resolved into something coherent, something that made sense on the other side of the impossible. He thought without meaning to think it, I don't know how he's doing that. Then 2 beats later, I don't know if I could. The second thought was the one that mattered. Clapton had never thought it about anyone before. He'd watched guitarists for years. He'd respected some, admired a few, considered himself beyond most. Never once had that thought appeared. It sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong. Jimi finished the second song. There was a pause. One of those pauses that happens when a room isn't sure yet whether it's allowed to make noise. Then someone at the back started clapping, and the sound built into something genuine and slightly stunned. Jimi nodded once, left the stage. Clapton and Townshend stood where they'd been standing. Neither of them moved toward each other. The argument from the corridor, the one about levels, about who the players respected, about what it meant to be the best guitarist in London, had not been resolved. It had become irrelevant. A roadie walking past heard Clapton say something under his breath. The words were inaudible, but the expression on Clapton's face, he said later, was one he'd never seen on him before or after. Not upset, not angry, something quieter than that. Townshend found the nearest seat and sat down. He sat there for a long time. The accounts scatter after Jimi left the stage. Cream played their set. The venue emptied. But Townshend talked about that night in a 1975 interview. Carefully, the way people talk about things that cost them something. I'd been operating under a particular belief about myself, he said, that I was at the frontier, that I was at the absolute edge of what guitar could do, or at least close enough to the edge that the gap didn't matter. One night I watched someone play and understood that I'd been standing in the middle of the field the whole time, not the edge. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. It was necessary. Clapton, in a separate interview 7 years later, was more direct. Eric and I had been arguing about something stupid, he said, about who was better. We were both 21, and we both thought we knew what the ceiling was because we were near it. Then Jimmy played, and the ceiling disappeared. Not raised, disappeared. And the argument just stopped mattering. You can't keep arguing about who's the tallest person in a room when someone walks in who's on a different floor entirely. I didn't quit, Clapton said finally, but I went home that night and sat with my guitar for a long time. Alone, asking it questions I hadn't known I needed to ask. What happened to the argument in the corridor is not a story about defeat. Both Townshend and Clapton went on. They built careers that endured. They made records that mattered. They influenced generations of guitarists who would cite them first, before almost anyone else. But something shifted that night in the way each of them understood the instrument. The competitive frame, the one that asked who was better, cracked. It was replaced by something harder to hold but more useful. A sense that the guitar's possibilities were not a fixed territory to be claimed, but something open-ended, always larger than the last person who touched it. Townshend once said the greatest service one musician can do for another is to make them feel the size of what they don't know. Not to humiliate, just to make the unknown visible. Jimmy did that for a lot of people, and he said, he wasn't performing generosity, he was just playing. The effect was a side effect of the playing. Clapton kept it simpler. He was better, he said, in the flat and final tone of a man who had long since made peace with something. Not better than me at what I do, better than the version of better I thought existed. He made the word mean something different. You don't resent that, not if you're honest. You're just grateful you got to hear it. The graffiti on the walls of London that said Clapton is God stayed up for a while longer. Nobody paints over these things quickly. But in that corridor and on that small stage on an autumn night in 1966, two men who had been arguing about the highest point either of them could see had watched a third man walk past them both, upward, into something they hadn't known was there. Neither of them spoke about it much in the days that followed. Some things need time before they can be said without the rawness getting in the way. But the argument about who was better, that was over. It had ended without a verdict, the way the best arguments end. Not with a winner, but with both sides realizing they'd been asking the wrong question. Jimi Hendrix hadn't said a word. He hadn't needed to.